Hi, I'm Jamie. This is Dead Dodge Garage, and this is my Performance 318 build for Mark's 1968 Plymouth Barracuda notchback. I've done a whole series of videos on this build, which you can go back and find if you're interested. In the last episode, which was, I believe, 2 weeks ago, or maybe 3 weeks ago, I don't know how time works, I laid out the entire build recipe again and then started assembling the engine. The Cliff Notes version of the build recipe is as follows. Factory 1968 forged crankshaft. Factory rods with bushings in the small ends for floating pistons. KB flat top with valve relief pistons. A cam ground by organ cam grinders. A double roller timing chain. On top, we've got a set of 920 casting number 66 and 67 273 closed chamber heads. These were also used on 1967 318s only. These have been dressed with springs to match our camshaft, brand new valves, hardened valve seats, and as you can see, we're putting these very fancy and extremely expensive Harlan Sharp rockers on top. We've got some comp push rods in between these and the new lifters, which came from, I don't remember. Johnson lifters, I think. A few of them are already rusting sitting in the shop here. One episode was dedicated to cleaning up these 920 heads. I gave these a basic cleanup port job. I did a gasket match on the intake side. I knocked down the pushrod clearances just about as far as they could be. Blocked the exhaust crossover. Gave them a bowl blend. I did not go crazy enlarging port sizes or anything like that. I did also clean up the castings significantly. I filed the valve cover sealing surface. Might have half a chance of not puking oil out. I cleaned up all of the oil return areas and little things like that. On top, we'll have this Edelbrock Performer manifold. I'm port matching this as well. I'm still only done with one side for some reason. As you can see, since the end of the last video, I did get the rest of the rods and pistons installed in the engine. This is looking great. It turns over nicely, feels fantastic, so we're ready to move on. At least 3 different commenters on the last video told me that I should have installed the camshaft first because it's easier. It's easier because you can reach in through the bottom of the block and support the cam as you're passing it back. What I'm going to do is install the cam right now while the block is still upside down so I can support it through the openings in the casting. This is our camshaft. Again, this came from Organ Cam Grinders. I showed the cam card in the last video. I don't actually have it handy here. I wrote the specs down on a notepad, but I don't know where it's at. Their number for this cam is DO615HP. Installing that camshaft is my next move. Before I do that, I do need to pre-lubricate it. I'm lubricating all of the lobes on this camshaft with your typical engine assembly lube. This stuff contains moly graphite, and it also contains ZDDP, which is the magic chemical that coats lifter faces and these lobes to protect them and keep them from eating each other. Every single engine builder you ask will have a different preference for what kind of lubricant to use for this. I've used multiple in the past with good results. Somewhere around here I have an ancient bottle of actual Mopar camshaft and lifter lube. I don't know where that is and I can't be bothered to dig for it. I've used this stuff in the past with success, so that's what I'm going to do. This is a horribly messy job. Gonna have to put the camera down to complete it. Maybe I should mix this stuff a little bit. It's been on the shelf for a while. That's more like it. Should be a little snottier and a nasty gray color. I think what happened there is the additives were settling out of the base oil. That's what that should look like. A horrible, goopy mess. Nicely, mostly uniformly covered lobes. Looks good. We'll put a coating of the same stuff on the faces of the lifters, though not on the sides of the lifters. On the sides of the lifters and on the bearing journals on the cam, I use regular engine oil. And now it's time to install this cam. I've got oil on the bearing surfaces and also a little bit on the distributor gear. I'll hit that with some more later. Now I'm going to carefully pass it into the bearings, and I'm going to try very hard not to nick any of them with lobes as they go by. Now obviously when you're at this point, it's pretty easy to hold onto the cam. I've got a 7/16 by 4-inch long bolt at the front here, and I've got my hand guiding it. Now when you get much further than this, it will be really helpful to change to supporting this cam from underneath, because the shorter this area gets, the harder it is to guide. So I'm gonna reach in here and get even greasier. Again, carefully, steadily, slowly feed the camshaft into the block. Now Johnson always checks these cam bearings after they install them to make sure a cam spins in them freely. It's not at all uncommon or surprising to end up slightly nicking a cam bearing as it's being installed. I've done it myself, and I've had to go in and repair them before. I didn't actually check this camshaft, but we're good. Okay, now we can remove this, and we're ready to... There's no woodruff key in this cam. Okay, I guess I get to put a woodruff key in this cam. That would have been nice to know before it was in the engine. No big deal. We'll install a woodruff key and then we'll be ready to time it. But first, I have one more job to complete here in the bottom of the engine. Maybe two more jobs. In the last video, I made mention of a windage tray. A windage tray is a great addition to a higher performance engine build. This keeps oil away from your crankshaft. That oil ends up being dragged around in the air surrounding your crankshaft and ramming into the counterweights and other surfaces on it, thereby creating extra drag. This can help to make a few horsepower. It's a great thing to have. This one came from Milodon. The tray number is 32230, and the bolt set for that tray for the small block Chrysler is 81151. Now I said bolts, but these are actually studs. We will be replacing 2 of the caps worth of main bolts in this engine with studs. A couple commenters were slightly concerned about this because differing clamping forces from these studs may deform our main caps ever so slightly. I, for one, choose not to worry about this. It could make a minuscule difference, but at this power level, for what we're doing, I'm just not worried. Now, the Milodon tray is very similar to the factory piece, but it's different in a few important ways. First, it's a much heavier material. These are pretty dinky and they tend to be damaged, just like this one. Also, as you can see, the mounting is somewhat different and the tray overall is shorter. The factory tray mounts to the number 2 and number 4 main caps. The Milodon tray mounts to the number 3 and the number 4. And it's missing about 2.5–3 inches of material at the front. I've got them roughly lined up with the oil pan. Essentially, you can see the area that will not be covered is this and the front 1.5 or 2 inches of the sump. The shape at the back is also slightly different, and I imagine this is to account for a Milodon performance pickup and pan setup that fit the small block. Also, the design of the little vents in the trays is a little bit different. The factory has these tabs at the bottom. The Milodon has 3 of these vents in these segments and 2 in the back there. I will tell you there's a goofy typo on the box for this tray that says you need a different set of studs for a 318 than a 360. That is not correct. 318s, 340s, 360s, even 273s all use the same type of main bolts. There is a difference in spacing here, and you can see on the Milodon tray they've accounted for that. This will fit either one of them. The factory 340 tray does not have that provision. It only has the narrower set of bolt holes. Also, as you can see, those holes are much smaller. 360 trays that were used on the E58, those have the oval holes and they fit both. There may be factory 340s that use that tray, I'm not sure, but this one's a lot more common to find. If you're trying to put a factory windage tray on a 360, you can widen these bolt holes. I've done that in the past and it works just fine. It's kind of funny because the instructions say this mounts to the number 2 and 4 mains, but it doesn't. It's definitely 3 and 4. Anyway, I'm going to pull these bolts out now, and I'm going to install the studs. Now, the instructions do say to remove the factory bolts, take the cap off, and run a bottoming tap all the way to the bottom of the main bolt hole because the threading there can vary a good bit. They want this stud to seat fully in the block. I'm going to inspect these holes and see if I think that's actually necessary in this case. Apparently, for some of their low-profile pans, this will contact. I'm really hoping it's not going to be a problem with my stock stuff. Well, that's interesting. Look how much longer the stud is than the factory main bolt. From the underside of the head to those threads, 3/4 of an inch or more? And then you've got 1.5 inches or so of coarse threads for the nut. And then you've got another 1.25 inches or so for the tray mounting. Maybe you do have to tap those holes deeper. Okay, yeah, that just straight up doesn't work. It doesn't hit the pan at all. We've got room there. But there's not enough threads, even with the washer they provide, to get a nut tight on that. As mentioned, the instructions say specifically that you need to tap the hole deeper so the stud can go in farther. But I'm wondering, is this going to sneak by inside the threads? It looks like that shoulder is slightly larger than the threads, so I have a feeling that's hitting the block above the hole and stopping. I happen to have a 360 block handy, and this is interesting. I can see through the main holes in the 360. They are not blind, but the stud appears to be sticking out of the block the exact same amount. I've got the number 3 main cap off, so you can see this stud installed in our 318. Note that shoulder is not bottoming out, and you can see the top of one thread in there. So I am going to have to come up with a tap, ideally a bottoming tap, to run down this hole and remount the threads further down so this stud will seat fully. Even then, I don't know if that is enough of a gap to make up for what I'm seeing here. Of course, I don't own a suitable tap. I don't own any taps in that size. So basically, I'm screwed. It's the next day, and I'm trying to figure out this whole stud debacle. First, I grabbed a head bolt, which has longer threads than the main bolts. I ran this down as far as I could, and it stopped right here with 2 threads exposed. That's about the same amount that the stud went in, so I'm confident I'm not actually hitting the shoulder or anything. I took a small screwdriver and I ran that down the hole to find the end of the hole. Yeah, there's another like half of an inch down there, I'd say, that's not threaded. I found one. This is not a bottoming tap, but again, we've got about a ½ inch extra depth to play with. I really only need about 1/4, so I'm hoping this will be enough. I could do as I've done in the past and grind off the last thread or 2 on that. Because we already have threads in the hole, we don't necessarily need as much of a pilot on there. I don't do a lot of thread tapping, but every time I do, I'm very glad I invested in these years ago. These are tap sockets. They have different square drives down there and little snappy rings to hold your tap in place. Obviously, I'm going to be very careful with metal shavings, and that's why I'm putting grease on the tap to hopefully catch all of that. Compared to some materials, cast iron is relatively easy to drill and tap. Even so, the tap I'm running down these holes is not wanting to advance quickly, and I'm having to be very careful. Since I broke the last tap I tried to use on the channel, I don't want to repeat that. Now, what I was about to show you before I found that tap was how you can make your own tap. You can slice a clean out groove in the threads of a nice heavy duty bolt like this one, and tapering the end of it ever so slightly can help as well, although as you can see there is a tapered end already. I've done that in the past with success. The tap is probably more ideal though. This thing is stopping pretty hard as it's getting to the bottom of those threads, and so I was concerned maybe I was bottoming out, but this thread was still exposed and the hole was that deep. I'll have you know, I did put on some rapid tap, the very end of a bottle that I had at my old shop. I could swear that one on the left looks lower, but according to the tape measure, not so much. I don't know how we get there from here. Fairly certain the shoulders are now bottoming out in the block, but there's that much space left. These studs clear the oil pan, and at this point, I'm strongly considering just adding extra washers to get the nut to a point it will actually hold torque. I don't know if that's a recommended procedure, but I don't have many other choices. The only other choice would be to grind these shoulders down to the point that they fit inside the threaded area, then continue carefully tapping the hole deeper, which is not going all of that well. I'm really concerned I'm going to break something. No matter how far down in that hole this threaded stud goes, the amount of clamping force isn't going to change. So I think spacing up the nut is a fine choice. This is what we're going with. I'm using doubled ½ inch lock washers. I'm using these because they're the same OD as this washer, and so they fit here. The only other ½ inch washers I have are like this big, and I'm not going to do a whole bunch of work to grind those down. Obviously, we are not using these because they are split lock washers. Personally, I don't really believe in that. These are torqued to 85 foot-pounds, which is the factory torque spec, but also the torque spec provided with the Milodon studs. Now, because the number 3 main cap had to come out and it contains our thrust surfaces, I did have to reset the thrust. What I always do is force the crank forward and then force the crank rearward, then torque down these fasteners. You can see the thrust movement here. You should have some, but not a ton. I'm not going to remeasure this as I did it in the last video, and I'm confident it's still good. I do like the idea of having these studs with their theoretical extra clamping force on this number 3 cap, because on teardown, this was the cap I found did not register in the block at all. We did have this improved by the machine shop, that's why we've got these marks here, but it still wasn't quite the press fit I expected. I'm hopeful that this will help keep this cap from walking under any conditions. I am just so confused. This set of instructions says torque the stud to 10-15 foot-pounds. These instructions say hand tight. The countersinking for these rear studs must have gone further into the block because I was able to tap these enough to get down to 1 extra washer. I don't love this, but I'm confident it's going to work just fine. With the new studs installed and torqued, everything spins great. Now that everything is fully assembled and torqued, I've realized that my previous oil pan test fit was flawed somehow, and there's totally an interference issue with that little lump there. That's a dent. I believe that's designed to go around the A-body steering, so we may need that. I could tap it with a hammer, or I could cut part of the shoulder off of our stud. We'll probably go for the latter option carefully once I finalize the tray installation. In case you were wondering, this is exactly why I prefer to deal with factory parts, because they actually fit. Anyway, as you may have noticed in that last shot, I installed the first set of smaller nuts included with these Milodon studs upside down, such that their flat serrated faces are pointed this way toward the tray. That way it'll sit flat on all four of them. I've got them run all the way down the studs currently. I do need to even those out before installing the other set, such that the tray sits perfectly flat on all four. That way we're not bending or tweaking the tray to try and get everything torqued. Currently, with the nuts in their fully down position, I think we're actually good. Note the gap we've got from the rod hardware to the window on that tray. It looks to be somewhere between 1/4 inch and 3/8 of an inch. I actually think a little bit less of a gap than that would have been fine, but this is what we've got without modifying anything or trying to get it closer to the crank. This is probably what we're going to go with. The instructions say you should start with that inner set of nuts at 3 3/4 to 3 7/8 of an inch off of the oil pan rail, and that's pretty much right where we're at. The instructions specify an 1/8 inch gap at minimum from any moving parts. Again, we've got more than that, and in theory the tray could be a little bit closer, but the amount of work it would take to make that happen seems excessive. So I'm gonna go ahead and square these nuts where we're at, and then we'll get the second set and torque them down to 35 foot-pounds. I had to raise both of these slightly, and now the tray sits square on all four, and I can't rock or wobble it. I squirted a drop of oil on all four of the studs, and then I launched one of these nuts across the shop, but I did find it. And there it is, installed and torqued. I did also crank the engine over several times, just watching and listening. We've got no contact issues or anything of that sort, so I feel good about it. We could have had this almost 1/4 inch further down, looking at that nut in there as it goes by the window, but there's nothing I could do short of grinding the heads of those nuts down, and that just seems crazy. Today is 3/18. March 18th, that is. I almost forgot. What an appropriate day to be wrapping up this build. Well, not to suggest that it'll be fully wrapped up, but at least we can try. If we had a camshaft attached to the crank with a timing chain and like heads, well, that would be pretty great. I was just about to start cutting that one shoulder stud for oil pan clearance when I had the thought that maybe I should compare this to some other pans. I have multiple A-body compatible pans here in the house, and none of them have that same dimple. So I think what I'm going to do instead is tap that with a hammer a little bit and make it fit. If it becomes a problem in the future, we'll have learned something, I guess. Okay, we've got clearance around the stud. That wasn't so bad. I've learned 2 additional things. First, this pan is not straight. Second, it's hitting the tray on this side ever so slightly. I actually loosened all those nuts again and shifted the tray as far over as I possibly could. These bolt holes line up, pretty much. These ones are just off center. Instead of pulling it off of there again and going at it with a burr, I decided to just tweak it by hand. So I bent this edge inward slightly, I bent that edge outward slightly, and now the pan does actually fit and line up with the holes. Of course, because we've got so much clearance around the crank and rods, I'm not at all worried about that. I could have bent it in a good bit more without ever hitting anything. This is a Melling M72. Note, it is not an M72 high volume, it's just a standard M72. And this is the 72-S2 small block oil pump pickup. Now this, of course, is going to thread into this hole. The factory would have made that union with 0 sealant whatsoever. I probably will throw some Teflon tape on it just to make myself feel all warm and fuzzy. Felpro gasket sets come with an oil pump gasket that seals this surface to the number 5 main cap where the pump mounts. The factory didn't use a gasket there, and I don't either. I recently tore down a 340 that had a gasket installed here, but they had missed one of the bolt holes, so the whole thing was like kicked off to the side. That's not a great idea. If you are going to put the gasket in here, maybe install it correctly. Just a thought. Now, it's always a good idea to open your shiny new oil pump, check all the surfaces, and make sure it's not full of metal shavings. This thing looks pretty good. I'll dribble some new engine oil in here to make sure it's well lubricated before we pre-lube this thing later, and it should be good to go. Well, I stand corrected on that cutout being for a special Milodon pickup. The factory one goes right through that space, so you have to have that. I've got the pump in place and torqued now, and as you can see, I've got the pickup a little above, parallel with the pump housing face there. Essentially what we want to do is make sure we have room for adjustment by tightening the pickup further. And as you can see, we do need to tighten it down because we've got about a finger's worth of gap on this one rail. So I'll do that. Ideally, you'll have the pickup perfectly touching the bottom of the pan with no gasket in place. Then when you add your gasket, you get a gap like that. There you go. Absolute perfection. If you don't know, A-bodies with V8s from the factory use one of these 90-degree oil filter adapters. This is so you can run the tall filter with a Wix part number 51515. You can run a short filter on the truck style or B-body style plate. That's an option too. I think the short filter number is 51068, something like that. There's even a super short one that works in early A-bodies, but it's really nice to have this 90-degree in the tall filter. Unfortunately, the Felpro gasket set only comes with the large outside ring seal. It doesn't seem to have the little short cork that goes in the middle or a new copper washer for under the bolt head. So we're having to order a new seal set for this. For that reason, I won't be installing it this minute, although I would have liked to have done that. So now it's rolled up the normal way again, and we can continue with stuff up here. If you're not familiar with a Woodruff key, it's this half-moon shaped chunk of steel. Now this goes into a slot in your camshaft. There's a larger one that goes in your crankshaft as well. And this is what locates the gear. I'm pulling this one out of some random stock cam. I have no idea what this is. It's just sitting in my core pile. I might have a new one somewhere, but I don't know where it is. Pry bar and a light hammering work. Because it's half-moon shaped, tapping on it in either direction will help start knocking it out of there. And there it is, tapped into the new cam. Now it's time to install the camshaft retaining plate. But before I do that, I want to cover a few things because I've had some comments. First, this thing goes in front of the camshaft and keeps it from walking forward. Big block Chryslers don't have that feature at all. The only thing that forces the camshaft in a big block Chrysler rearward is the angle of the lobes, which is slight, it's hard to see by eye, but it's there, and the taper on the faces of the lifters. Those two surfaces work together to keep the camshaft in place. For this reason, when you put a roller cam in a big block, you have to add a little buttony thingy to keep the camshaft from moving. In the small block, we've got this thing. Makes life really easy. I discussed an oiling mod in a previous video, which involves drilling a hole through this, then drilling a hole through the plug in the oil galley behind this plate. That allows oil to come out and shoot at the timing chain, and I'm not saying that's a bad idea, but it's nothing I've ever done. Because this engine isn't really all that high performance, I'm not going to bother in this case. Now, as you can see on this plate, just by those impressions alone, it was retained with 4 hex head bolts, which are right here. These are normal bolts. Unlike what one commenter suggested, none of them has a hole in it. They're just normal bolts. The commenter in question informed me that there is a bolt with a hole in it, and then it goes in this location and allows oil from the galley to fall down on the timing chain. 2 problems with that. Number 1, the factory bolt doesn't have a hole, as I just showed you. And number 2, that is not the oil galley. That is the valley, and there may be a small amount of oil pooled there at some point, but no pressurized oil is behind that bolt. And for this bolt hole over here, it's blind, so there's no pressurized oil there either. Both of these are open into the inside of the block, but again, no pressurized oil. On the poly engine, that top left hole is not open into the valley here, but it's also blind like this side. It does not go into the oil galley. If you want to get that pressurized oil to your timing chain, through these plugs is the only way to get there. You'll use a very small drill bit of a certain size, which I don't know, to drill a hole here in the center, and again, a matching hole in the plate. Now this is interesting. Over here on my 340, there is a bolt with a hole in it. It is not one of the factory bolts. That is an aftermarket bolt that someone drilled. Probably Dale, if I were to hazard a guess. Now this engine has one of those fancy Magnum 3.9 style timing chain tensioners, and it has a built-in oil dripper right here. So I'm guessing the thinking was, add this, and hopefully some oil will dribble down from inside the engine toward that dripper to get extra lubrication on the chain. This actually reminds me, I've had questions asking why I don't use these things. I don't know. Never thought of it, I guess. I will consider one for my 273. For this 318, the standard dual roller is going to be just fine. Here's the factory plate and hardware from a 273 I took apart recently. Notice again, exactly the same, no hole. At some point in history, Chrysler started using a sheet metal drip tray. It looks a whole lot like the one on my 340 that's built into that crazy timing chain tensioner assembly. It takes the place of one of these bolts, and I can't remember which one it is. And I don't know when they started doing that. And I don't know if, when they started doing that, it was across the board or if it was on certain engines. Obviously, if this engine had one, we'd put it back in. Okay, I went and looked it up. They bolt to this hole, and they have a tab that locks into this hole, but it leaves the rest of it open. So there again, oil running down the inside of the block may well end up directed to that dripper through that hole. Even if the bolt hole there is not effective at directing extra oil out here, you can see just by the pattern of oil coming down from the front camshaft bearing that lubrication is going to be available for the timing chain from that location. There's the cam plate installed. These tiny bolts get torqued to something like 12 foot-pounds. I don't know, tight, but not too tight. I also pre-lubricated the face in here that rubs on the camshaft. Very nice. Here's our shiny new dual row camshaft gear installed on the cam. Notice I've got the dot pointing downward roughly, and the woodruff key points off like that way. I've always found that kind of interesting. When I align the crankshaft to TDC, this woodruff key points roughly to number 1 there. Quite a while ago now, I did a video on a 1967 Dodge Charger that was having some really interesting runnability issues. I went through a ton of stuff on that car before I finally figured out the timing chain was set wrong. Like very, very wrong. What they had done was pointed the woodruff key on the crank upward when they installed the chain. Please don't do that. If you want to do this right, use a degree wheel. I'm hoping to demonstrate that in just a minute here. If you're not going to do it right, at least align the dots. The woodruff key is not the dot. On some of the 3-way adjustable sets, there is a 0 above the woodruff key opening. And I have seen someone in the past align it that way because they thought that was the mark. It's not. The camshaft gear fit right over that used woodruff key. The crank gear, not so much. I'm gonna go get a brass drift and carefully drive this thing down from side to side. Brass drifts are great because you hit them with a hammer instead of your steel parts, and the softer material doesn't damage your parts. They're not great because they leave little bits of brass debris behind, so make sure you clean all of that when you're done. You know, I use a lot of brake clean. I don't use apprentice levels of brake clean, but I sure put a lot of money into this stuff. I've got the timing chain installed dot to dot, which in theory should be correct. But we're gonna verify this with a degree wheel because I happen to have one. First, I do need to get the cam gear tight to the cam, so I'm gonna get that hardware together now. We've got an eccentric that runs the mechanical fuel pump. Then we've got a cam bolt, and between the two, we have a special washer. Notice, that thing is cupped. The cup needs to go inward. If you make a mistake and you install the cup outward toward the bolt head, well, 100 miles after getting this car together and breaking in the engine, you're gonna get towed off the side of the road by your brother with his duster. All right, that was oddly specific. Hey, some lessons are cheaper than others, and you're getting this one for free. I've been telling everybody on the internet I'm an idiot for like a really long time now. See, what that washer does is reaches down around the little snout of the camshaft sticking through and holds tightly to the eccentric, which then holds tightly to the gear. I saw a post on the Small Block Mopar group the other day from a gentleman asking how much slop his brand new timing chain should have. Just about everyone I've ever seen has slop like this. A few commenters said, oh, that's too much, that should be way tighter. Okay, I've never seen one that was. This is my degree wheel. Someone gave me this like a year or two ago. I've only ever used it a couple times. Previously, I was just an install it dot to dot and it's probably fine guy, but I do like the idea of being precise with this. Your camshaft is intended to be installed at a certain angle relative to the crankshaft's position. The manufacturer has timed the valve events to achieve a certain result. If the camshaft is not installed at that correct angle, bad stuff can happen. Well, low performance can happen. Also, you may choose to advance or retard the camshaft for various strategic reasons. Unfortunately, we cannot assume that every timing set is created equal, and we also can't assume that the cam grinder did in fact grind that cam at the correct angle. Now, I don't have an adjustable timing set on this engine, so if it is wrong, that'll be a bit of a problem. All we're going to do is rig up the degree wheel, and we'll use a dial indicator to profile the intake valve opening events. Hopefully this will tell us that the cam is installed correctly and we can move on. Obviously the first step is to install the degree wheel. That's a little bit complicated on one of these small block Mopars because they have this big long shouldered bolt. I could use a big block bolt, which is shorter and has no such shoulder, but I don't have one handy, so I managed to find a nut that fits on this one, and I'm going to install this like that through the wheel and into the crank. The degree wheel set comes with this mag-based dial indicator for 2 reasons. The first is finding TDC to align our degree wheel. I'm going to use it to watch as the piston comes up, and when it stops moving, that's top dead center. Except we've got dwell to contend with. there is a brief period of crank rotation where the piston doesn't move at all. So we're going to use this thing to find both sides of that dwell. We'll hone in on an accurate mark, get the pin aligned perfectly in the middle of those two, and then move on. I might not have explained that very well, so I'm going to try and show you. Watch the dial as the piston comes up. There will be a point where it stops. Whoop, right there. Okay, so I'm going to go back. That's our dwell, and it's not very wide. So that's just a few degrees where this doesn't move at all. I'm going to say right there is probably right. Now what we'll do is zero this reading, and then we'll come up to that point from both directions and make sure we're equally on both sides of zero. Now the other thing you can do is use a piston stop. I don't currently have a cylinder head installed, so that's kind of hard to do. I could throw one on there. Then essentially you go against the stop both directions, mark where that is on your wheel, and tweak the wheel a little bit to ensure that it's correct. Here's one of the pointers from the kit and a random bolt I found. This took a couple of tries, but I'm now satisfied that that is very, very close to an accurate 0 degree top dead center reading. And now I've got our mag base lined up on the intake tappet. I'm going to attempt to match these opening events, when the lifter moves, to the cam card that we have and ensure that that is correct. By doing this, I should be able to ensure that the center line of the camshaft is what the manufacturer intended. Note, our current position is dot to dot. This is valve overlap, so both of these lifters are slightly unseated. They're slightly up off of the base circle of the cam. This is an important note because when you install your timing chain dot to dot, this is not TDC1. It's 180 degrees away from TDC1. This is a problem if you set your timing chain like this and then drop your distributor right in, because if you align it at number 1, it'll be wrong. You need to drop your distributor in with both dots up. That is TDC1. On the cam card, the spec for the intake lobe centerline is 106 degrees. I've got the degree wheel set at 106 now. Well, that's not where the centerline is. The lobe continues to lift until right there. That's 123 degrees. So now I have a question. 1, are the dots wrong? 2, did I install the cam gear wrong? Did I not have the dots aligned at all? I'm going to try and figure that out. Well, what do you know? Apparently, one tooth on the cam gear is approximately 18 degrees. And 23-ish minus 6-ish is very close to that. Well, yeah, obviously it's off by a tooth. I'm kidding. I guess I'm going to kick this off one tooth that way, and then we'll recheck. Here's how I've got the timing marks now. This actually took 2 tries. The first try, I ended up just putting it right back where it was. How wrong does that look? Very. And again, I've verified that this 0 degree mark is right. I even went back and checked it again. It's definitely correct. We've definitely got the piston all the way up and in the middle of its dwell. And the dots align like this. But by putting them like that, I can now crank this to full intake lift, and it actually lines up. I can only assume you won't be able to read the dial from there, but maybe you can see it moving. I'm going to find the top of its travel again, which is right there. My needle is now pointed at 109. 3 degrees off compared to like almost 20. I think I'm gonna take that. I tried to repeat the process for exhaust. The problem, I think, is that the numbers on the wheel go in both directions. As you can see, I hand wrote 360 degree numbers for whatever process I was doing before because it made sense at the time. For the exhaust, I think you have to count this differently. It ended up somewhere over here, and if you subtracted the spec, which is a center line of 114 from 360, it was very close to the number I saw. I'm just not 100% sure. So I've gone back to the cam card and the intake lobe where things make sense. The specification for the intake valve opening event is given at 50 thou tappet lift. That means you don't find exactly where this starts to move because that could be complicated. Instead, you zero your mic and then you find 50 thou lift. Of course, if you know cam specs, you know that a useful duration spec is given at 50 thou tappet lift, so it's a good reference point. What I did was zero this and then start cranking until I saw 50 thou. That's one full rotation of the large dial here. According to the cam card, 50 thou tappet lift for the intake lobe should occur at 0 degrees. Mind you, of course, this is 180 out. This is when the intake stroke starts, the piston goes down, and the intake valve is opening. By putting this at 50 thou tappet lift, we should have put this perfectly at TDC. And I can confirm I did because, what do you know? The pointer is lining up, almost, with 0 on my degree wheel. And again, at that point, this is what our dots look like, which is just not right. There is no way these dots align. Look how far off center they are. But I believe the degree wheel, and I've double checked my work here using multiple specifications from the cam card. The way I have it installed now is the way it's meant to be installed. And that is just wrong. I guess that goes to show you, when you buy a random timing set that says a premium on the box, it might not be premium. Anyway, I hope that makes sense. This is why degreeing your cam is so important. If I had just installed that dot to dot, the cam would have been off an entire tooth. That's 18 degrees of timing in relation to the crank. And that ain't good. When you use an adjustable timing set, I think the maximum adjustment it gives you is about 7 degrees, and a typical adjustable 3-way set will only give you 2 degrees of advance or retard on the camshaft. In all likelihood, if I had just installed that dot to dot, this engine would have run like absolute garbage. So I'm glad we did this. Now, if you don't have a degree wheel, there is another way to at least verify your camshaft is in the ballpark. I learned this trick from Uncle Tony. He's actually done 2 different videos on it over the years. He learned this trick from Keith Black back in the bad old days. Essentially, what you do is you compare the height of your lifters at valve overlap, and then you compare them again at TDC1 when both valves are closed and both lifters are in the downward position. You can see I've got a pair of lifters and a straight edge rigged up here because at TDC1, these lifters are slightly below the casting here, and I can't put the straight edge right across them. I'm not going to try and demonstrate how I took this measurement because it's a gigantic pain. Just know that if you're going to use a pair of lifters, they're crowned and they have to be perfectly centered to get an accurate reading. But I found a gap over the exhaust lifter. Of course, these lifters are in an exhaust, intake, exhaust order, matching the cylinder head and the valve positions. At overlap, that gap was about 20 thousandths of an inch. At TDC1, the gap was smaller at about 16 thousandths of an inch. Now, I can't stress enough that these measurements were not the most accurate in the world. This is really tricky to get right. There are other ways you can do this too. If you have a cylinder head and rocker arms, you can measure at the rocker arm. But if you have hydraulic lifters, they may well be soaking up some of this movement, and you might not get the most accurate of readings. You are likely to have a gap here due to differences in the base circle size on the camshaft, in lifter construction. There are all kinds of variables. So you're looking for a gap, a difference between the two, and you're gonna find it over one lifter or the other, unless they're perfectly in line, in which case, good for you. I found my gap over the exhaust lifter in both cases. The gap was larger at overlap than it was at TDC1 when both lifters are on the base circle. That tells me this camshaft is ever so slightly advanced because at this point in overlap, the intake valve is opening and the exhaust valve is closing. And because the gap is larger, that means the intake valve is further out. I found a difference of 4 thousandths of an inch. And again, this is not 100% accurate. According to Tony, approximately 6 thousandths of an inch of a difference is 2 degrees. So we've got almost 2 degrees our camshaft is advanced. If I were to choose between advanced and retarded for this particular engine, I would choose advanced because an advanced camshaft favors low-end torque. This is a street car with a street gear and a stock torque converter. So we'll take every little bit of extra torque we can get. This also helps me confirm that my previous work with the degree wheel was accurate, and these marks really are that far off. Whew! I spent a lot of time on that. I almost refused to believe that those marks were as wrong as they are. Welcome to the future. Good times. At this point, as usual, I'm kind of running out of time. So the next thing I'm going to do is get all of the lifters lubricated and installed, and then I'm going to drop on the cylinder heads. Now, I do want to point this out to you real fast. Notice that lube I slabbered all over the camshaft. Well, it's riding up on this lifter now. And this is a great way to explain to you that it's essential you limit the number of times your engine turns before its first start. With every sweep of this lobe past that lifter, the magic sauce is getting wiped off, and that's not a good thing. So now I get to scrub these little bits of surface rust off of these lifters. I'm gonna hit these faces with that same assembly lube stuff oil the sides as I did those other two I already dropped in, and get these in the engine. But first, I'm going to look at the crowns on these lifters. See, it's absolutely essential that the proper crown is ground into these lifters. The lack of that crown, or the lack of a correct crown, is one of the biggest issues with these lifters today. The best way to check these is on a perfectly flat surface like a piece of glass. I don't happen to keep anything like that in the shop, although I really should. So what I generally do is check two lifters against each other. What you're looking for is a bit of rock there. It's really hard for me to demonstrate that with one hand, but I can tell we've got crowns on these. Now, checking them against each other does leave open the possibility that one of the lifters that you're checking is flatter than the others. You got to use your best judgment there. I kind of look for the amount of rock to be even between all of them, and I found that to be the case with these. It's a little while later, and all of the lifters are cleaned, pre-lubricated, and installed. If you're not hip to this, it's absolutely essential that your lifters pass a drop test. They should be able to move totally freely in their bores. There should be nothing keeping these lifters from spinning on the lobes during engine operation. All right, before we call it, I'd really like to see cylinder heads sitting on this engine. I need to clean the deck surfaces one more time, drop on my new head gaskets, make sure they're clean the deck surfaces on the heads themselves, and then drop them on. Now remember, this engine was cleaned by a machine shop, but there's still grime on these deck surfaces. There's going to be oil from the assembly process. There's going to be oil from my fingers. All sorts of things. So you need to go around and clean these as well as you possibly can. Now, as you can see, what I use for this is a blue towel with some brake clean on it. Blue towels do tend to leave behind just a little bit of lint, but compared to the alternatives, they're pretty much the best I've found. I'll generally go over this afterward again with a clean finger and rub off as much of the lint as I possibly can. You might be thinking microfiber is a good option. No, they're terrible. They leave little hairy balls everywhere. So this is what I've been doing for years now, and it works. I wouldn't clean like a person's insides during surgery with this, but it's good enough for cylinder head gaskets. Hey, that's not just good, it's good enough. I've said this in many previous engine building videos, but not in this one yet. It is absolutely essential that you scrutinize everything that's going into your new engine. Like this gasket, for example. Looks pretty nice. It's brand new. I just pulled it out of the package, so it should be good to go, right? Well, there are a couple little bits of debris on here, and a couple little rust spots on this combustion ring. I already scraped them somewhat, but you can see the stains there. There were little bits of cardboard stuck to this gasket too. And whatever that is, you need to be watching for that sort of thing. I am far from the world's greatest engine builder. So far. But by following that general guideline and paying attention to fine details, I've been pretty successful in this endeavor. So that's the best advice I can give you. Check everything, especially new stuff. I think we've learned a lot about that today. See? Brand new out of the box, covered in crap, and slightly rusty. One head installed. Had a bit of an issue with it hanging up on one of those dowel pins. These heads were decked. The surfaces were pretty nasty, and I suspect there was a little burr left in that hole that I didn't catch because I didn't scrutinize it closely enough. I've actually seen that before. I've had an issue with a dowel pin fouling up in a head, holding it up off of a head gasket. And there we have it. 2 cylinder heads loosely installed with 1 bolt each because I am totally out of time. Yeah, this is looking pretty dang good though. I don't know about you, but I'm getting excited. With any luck, you got some useful tips about cam timing and windage trays in this video. You didn't get to see a fully assembled 318, but we're getting closer. On the next outing, we'll be fitting those fancy Harlan Sharp rockers and maybe finishing the intake manifold, which I still haven't gotten to, and then dressing this thing. And that'll be nice. Until then, as ever, thank you very much for watching. And remember, new parts suck.